They would love it.
Still moving in, huh?
Yeah, you know how it is.
But new doesn't always mean good.
She didn't want this family in her neighborhood. Come hell or high water, she was going to get rid of them.
Stay away from my family!
And in this neighborhood, new spells disaster.
He's a criminal.
She was trying to protect herself from danger.
What's your problem?
He did what he had to do to defend himself.
It was a horrible thing to watch. It was beyond belief.
I want my
From the window of the family car, 8-year-old Laura Villar sees a world of enchantment.
I could see fish swimming in the water. I could see dolphins swimming around. It was the most just incredible thing that I had ever seen in my life. I was so excited to be there.
There is Longboat Key, Florida. Laura is moving from New Jersey with her mom, Erica, and dad, Jean-Pierre. Everyone knows him as JP.
We went down to Florida a lot when I was 5 or 6, and we all fell in love with it. And my dad was like, let's go. This is perfect. It's beautiful. You guys are going to love it. And we packed up and we moved to Florida.
We can pretty much see the water from here. All right.
They're taking over a rental property from one of our neighbors, Dan Schleifer.
Guys. Hey, there he is.
I was able to work with the landlord and arrange the situation that when I was moving out, I had a tenant to fill my shoes. That's where he wanted to live, and he thought his family would love it.
But the decision to move here wasn't made purely on a whim.
JP was a carpenter. He worked for a remodeling company. JP had a serious back injury from carrying a bathtub up a flight of stairs, and he was looking forward to getting corrective surgery done.
Be careful.
He wanted to recover in a peaceful area, laying in the Gulf of Mexico.
It was important for him to get back on the workforce. JP did not like being sidelined and not being able to work. His priority in life was supporting his family. End of story.
He was kind of like a superhero to me, to be honest. My dad was always my superhero.
Use some iced tea.
Looking like home.
They seemed like a very happy family. I have to admit that they made me a bit jealous.
Welcome to Florida, guys.
Little Florida hospitality.
Florida, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Guess new neighbors are moving in today.
Oh, yeah? How's it look out there?
Holly Bodner and her partner, Ted Higbee, live next door to the Villars.
Holly Bodner was a Florida licensed psychologist. She had a private practice.
Holly was extremely smart, well-spoken, very intelligent woman. Even though she had a live-in boyfriend, she functioned very much like a strong single woman.
Ted, meanwhile, treads a very different path.
That's great. This is what I want to do with the credenza I picked up yesterday.
Ted Higbee was involved in the antiques business. He sort of seems very secondary to Holly, almost as if he was sort of in her shadow. There was not a lot of Ted Higbee out there. It was all Holly, Holly, Holly.
Should we go for a walk? Come on, sweetie, let's go.
Having no children, they pour their affections into their dog, Pumpkin, who instantly proves a big hit with Laura.
Who's this? You got a new friend, Laura?
Everything seemed to be going really well. We met our neighbors. They all seemed friendly.
I'm JP.
I'm Ted.
I thought that it was going to be good because there's 2 neighbors that we could be best friends with.
Hello.
Holly was friendly. Ted seemed nice, too.
We'll have you over for a drink.
Oh, that'd be great. We love that. Yeah.
It started out fine. They were very happy. There was no initial problems.
I do.
Holly and Ted invited me and my mom and dad to go over there, and they were nice people. They were fun.
We could never have imagined the darkness to come. The Villars quickly settle into life on our street.
Making that for Laura?
Yes.
Erica gets a job in a video store, while JP homeschools Laura. Neighbor Holly continues with her high-pressure job. and she's not easily adaptable to all the changes on the home front.
Hey, Laura, sweetie, move your bike, hon. Thanks, hon.
Laura was always so happy and running around in a good mood, you know?
Laura would attract more kids down to the house, like any family with kids might do.
Hey, Holly, how are ya?
Still moving in, huh?
Yeah, you know how it is.
Yeah.
Here's a family that lives here because a kid has her toys outside. And that I don't think she liked at all. To me, that was the spark. That annoyed Holly.
Take care, huh? I'll see ya. Whoa, where's the fire, sweet pea?
I'm going to the beach, Dad. Ew.
Holly would let her dog go to the bathroom on our yard.
Most of the people on our street have dogs. There's a leash law. Some of them will run a little bit loose, and everybody just turns a blind eye to it.
I played out there. I ran out there, my bare feet. It got on my dad's nerves.
Hey, Holly! I think your dog left a little mess on our yard. Would you mind coming cleaning it up for us?
I don't know what you're talking about.
It would seem like a reasonable request to have Holly clean up after her dog.
According to JP, she refused to clean it up.
Maybe we should give it back to her. What do you think?
My dad was a huge jokester. He would do all kinds of crazy stuff. He was just a huge goofball.
He's crazy. He put crap on our doorstep.
I'll clean it up.
No. Leave it where it is.
It would be easy to misunderstand someone putting dog feces on your front door. Holly could see it as perhaps a threatening act or retaliation.
Yeah, actually, that is coming up real soon. I mean, that's, probably the biggest...
JP was not one to recognize trouble. To him, the situation didn't necessarily represent trouble, but it clearly annoyed Holly enough to get those wheels in motion.
Officer, surprise? What can I do for you?
Well, we got a call from
To think that something like this would totally change the dynamic of the friendship seemed pretty impossible to me, especially her being a psychologist.
I was just giving it back to her. It belongs to her.
Police let JP go with a warning, but that doesn't sit so well with Holly. She uses the tools at her disposal to dig into our new neighbor's background.
She did some work with the Sarasota and Manatee County court systems. A lot of that did involve prisoners and evaluating how dangerous they were.
What is it?
He's a criminal.
Who?
Our neighbor. He's a violent criminal.
She found a criminal record that he was beating his wife and abusing his kid.
Battery. He pled guilty. Wow. That's our new neighbor.
Holly's discovery changes everything.
John Villar had a record that would make you have a double take. You don't get much more harmful or dangerous.
And she's about to get a taste of just how violent he is.
She thought that she had to protect herself from danger.
The perspective from her home would be directly into Jay and Erica's house. There was nothing blocking that view.
Holly Bodner bears witness to the violent behavior of our new neighbor, Jean-Pierre Villar,
JP just hit his wife.
and confirms her worst fears.
What do we do?
He's a criminal.
Who?
Our neighbor.
Holly found a John Villar with a criminal record. I think anything that she saw at that point could only have made her more nervous about her neighbor.
What's your problem?
Holly and her partner, Ted Higby, decide to spread the word about the new menace on our street.
Morning, Lee.
How are you?
Good. You heard about our new neighbor that just moved in?
What about him?
John Villar. Oh, what a bad apple.
All of Holly's and Ted's energy was focused on the Villars and specifically JP.
Yeah. Anyway, listen, I gotta go. I'll tell you about it later.
Okay, okay. Huh. Good morning.
Oblivious to our neighbor's discovery, JP has his own axe to grind.
If your dog defecates on the neighbor's property, you don't leave it there. There was more than one incident, and he didn't appreciate it. So the next time Holly's dog hit that yard, he was saying something.
Ted! Ted!
Holly!
She said that JP came to her door. He was screaming. He was drunk.
Hey!
What do you want?
I want you to keep your dog off my yard. I mean it this time.
Just put him down on the porch.
She also said that he had threatened her, Higby, and the dog.
Pumpkin, come on. Come on, Pumpkin. It's okay. It's okay.
What's the matter?
Call the police.
Holly and Ted are hopeful that this time police will take action against JP's intimidation.
Hi. Trouble this time, officer.
We've had a complaint that you were threatening your neighbor.
Really?
It was very much a he said, she said kind of thing. Holly told the police that JP let loose with a string of obscenities and made obscene comments. JP's version was much different. He did say that they exchanged words, but he said he didn't make any threats at all.
Okay then, well, I'm sorry I took up your time.
With no evidence of a crime, police again let JP off the hook. Fearing reprisal from their neighbor, Holly and Ted take steps to defend themselves.
Holly installed a floodlight that was extremely bright.
It covered her entire yard and into our yard and our house. It was powerful.
They couldn't sleep at night because the light was so bright.
This time, it's the Villars' turn to call the police.
I responded to a report of a disturbance at Mr. Villar's residence. The floodlights were shining into his house and disturbing him.
Good evening. We've had some complaints about the lights.
When the police came to talk to her about the floodlights, Holly said that she needed them for her own security.
Those lights aren't on.
I know. What's you doing that for?
I heard complaints from the other neighbors as well because the light was so bright, so that was causing problems with everybody.
They are for my
I
protection.
understand that, but a complaint is a complaint. Shut them down.
In Longboat Key, there's a neighbor-friendly ordinance about lights, and so Holly was clearly in the wrong here.
Thank you.
You're all ganging up on me.
And I think she got upset about it. She probably felt a little bit like everybody was against her.
And I have to protect myself.
Come on inside. Come on inside.
I think that was enough to start Holly on a more dangerous path.
I don't know if Holly had a plan from the very beginning to get rid of the Villars, but it all snowballed where the only endpoint is kind of a disaster for everybody.
We are all shocked by what happens next.
I don't know whether this was a malicious act by Holly or whether it was just thoughtless.
Laura would ride up and down the street. That was her fun for the day. There wasn't much activity up the north end of Longboat Key.
I was riding my bike off to the side. I was still on the road, but she had plenty of room. I really thought she intentionally veered towards me, like she was going to hit me.
Deliberate or not, the incident puts JP on the warpath.
When JP knocked on her door to confront her, understandably so, Holly, how dare you threaten my 8-year-old daughter when she's riding her bike?
Stay away!
In my mind, his purpose of going over there was not retaliation. It was protection for his family. At this point, JP had high level of concern for his wife and daughter.
I started getting really anxious, like, oh God, what's this woman gonna do next? Like, she has some kind of vendetta against us.
He definitely made it very clear that I needed to stay away from her. Stay as far away from her as you can. He was provider and protector. That was his job.
Holly and Ted, however, see JP very differently.
Someone has to do something about him.
They believe they must protect themselves against the monster next door.
Holly was willing to do whatever she had to do. Everything just spiraled out of control.
I was afraid of her after that. The thought that she could so easily scare a child made me wonder what else she was capable of.
A once blossoming friendship
Stay away from my family!
is now shattered beyond repair.
Stay away!
JP Villar is outraged by our neighbor Holly Bodner's actions,
He's a violent criminal.
all of which are rooted in her disturbing discovery.
Narcotics, domestic battery. He pled guilty.
The thing is, she's actually made a terrible mistake.
When Holly did an online search for information about JP Villar, the individual Holly found, John Villar, had a record, and it was a little scary. But she found the wrong guy.
She found a guy named John Villar, and my dad's name was Jean-Pierre. She had it all wrong.
Ted! When she found another man whose name was similar and had a record, that probably just fueled her fire. I know when people start getting angry with one another and it escalates,
Baby, oh, watch the chair, honey, watch the
they
chair.
become illogical. And I think that that was what was going on.
Get back here! Don't make me run! What's your problem? Dad, oh my God!
Catch me!
Oh, I'm gonna get you. Come here, I'm gonna get you. Ah.
Perhaps she legitimately had some concerns about JP.
Nothing but problems, Holly?
But a lot of the things that she claimed that he didn't do. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't beating his wife, he wasn't threatening people.
And the truth was that my dad was a wonderful, loving, caring father that never would do anything to hurt me or my mom.
Holly is oblivious to the truth, and now the time for reconciliation is long gone.
I've seen people like her before, and it's trouble.
JP crossed paths with the wrong person.
Just as tensions look set to boil over, the date for JP's back surgery finally arrives.
JP needed a lot of repair work done. He needed a titanium rod inserted, a carbon fiber disc, and some vertebra fused.
Are you nervous, Daddy? I am.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous, babe, but I'm gonna be okay.
I knew he was in pain, and I knew that the pain was getting worse. His condition during this entire period was deteriorating up to the day of surgery.
All the neighbors, huh? Stay away from Holly.
We will.
Okay.
The operation is difficult, but successful. A fragile JP eventually returns home.
He was a strong guy, and sitting around was just not his forte.
Daddy, you're helping me here!
Hey, there she is. Oh, no hugs just yet, sweetie, okay? Here, give me one.
He told me that he was ready to get well again and get back to work again.
Okay. One step, careful.
All right, we're in.
Okay. Just a little
I got it.
Great.
Good. Right here. Perfect.
Yeah, okay.
For now, JP desperately needs rest in peaceful surroundings.
Thanks so much, guys.
We moved his mattress into the living room because he loved the view. We had the most beautiful view from our backyard.
Next door, however, Holly's paranoia is undiminished.
It would seem to me Holly, being a doctor, would back off if somebody had serious surgery.
What the hell?
It's her.
But she didn't.
Crazy.
Sleep deprivation is not going to help. It's only going to hurt. Trying to heal when these things are taking place by your neighbors must have been very unsettling, to put it lightly.
Grab the phone.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
The Villars again call the police to deal with our neighbor Holly's intrusive security lights. She doesn't back down.
I need to talk to the town manager now. I'm sorry. I am a taxpayer, and I demand.
And instead takes up her fight with the town hall.
Why isn't anybody?
Holly was in the town offices and got a little upset and had to be taken outside.
No, I will not calm down. I will not calm down. Oh, really? 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 Thank you. Thank you all so much for your help. Don't you touch me. Don't you dare. I am not taking my security.
Holly has now been thwarted at every turn.
It is on your head.
She thought that she was being picked on by the town. She thought they were persecuting her.
While she spirals, her neighbor JP is on the mend, and his once damaged relations with other neighbors are now thriving.
You look great.
Hey, neighbor.
You look great. How are you?
I'm
How are
doing
you?
okay, you know?
Welcome back, sir. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, huh?
Erica.
Ted Higbee was walking Pumpkin. There was a neighbor with his dog that was also on the street.
Control your dog.
Apparently the dog scuffled.
Hey, Ted, watch your mouth. I got a kid here.
Whoa. Villar, stay out of this already.
Ted, why do you keep...
JP was angry, telling Ted he was frustrated. Enough is enough.
Problems anymore. Get the hell out of here, man. Yeah, right. All right, enough with you already,
Go back to your psycho house.
You've had enough of you, man.
Higbee said that JP made obscene comments about Higbee's mother and threatened Higbee.
I'm just like crying and tears were just pouring down my face because I knew that my husband did not talk that way to people.
Hey, man. Settle down. Come on.
The confrontation is almost too much for JP to handle.
Mr. Villar obviously was in pain because of his back. I do recall his movements being very stiff and slow.
Yeah, enough.
The two sides are eventually separated. No charges are filed.
Do your job.
I would have never imagined that these minor incidents in this neighborhood dispute would have escalated to the point that it did.
I will find a way to protect.
Holly's in attack mode here to a point that none of us have ever witnessed. Her head spinning.
And I'll take care of this.
Holly didn't want this family in her neighborhood. Come hell or high water, she was going to get rid of them.
The day after the incident in JP's yard, Holly went to the Longboat Key police and asked them to forcibly commit him for a mental evaluation. The police refused because they knew that this was just a neighborhood dispute and not a situation where there was a crazed lunatic running around.
I don't think it mattered to Holly if JP was critically wounded. JP had to go. She felt that there was only one option left.
What our neighbor does next is both unethical and illegal.
I've been his doctor for over a year.
Using her authority as a psychologist, Holly pursues a judge's ruling to have JP put away.
I believe he physically abuses. She said that she had been his doctor for a year and had been observing him, that my husband's hands were his weapon, that he was going to kill me, that he was going to kill our daughter.
She claimed that he had brain damage. She claimed that he was drunk, that he was using drugs. She put things on that form that just weren't true.
And he's an excessive drinker.
John Villar.
Yes. The man is a serious threat.
Armed with the online criminal record she found for John Villar, she successfully argues J.P. Villar's danger to society.
I'm going to fast track this one for you, Holly.
The decision comes in just 14 minutes.
There were definitely some red flags that officials should have spotted and said, hold on, this guy's name isn't John, it's Jean-Pierre. But no judge wants to be the one who failed to act, and the person that was going to be evaluated goes out and hurts someone.
Holly used her license as a weapon. It was the most powerful weapon she had.
JP is ordered to be placed under mental observation, courtesy of a statute called the Baker Act.
The Baker Act is a pickup order for protective custody for a mental evaluation for up to 72 hours to provide care for that person.
Until now, the local Longboat Key police have been dealing with their neighbor's quarrel.
You said in your tone.
But this time, it's the county sheriff's department who are sent to apprehend JP at a time when his wife and daughter aren't home.
The sheriff's office would not have any previous knowledge of the ongoing dispute between Villar and Bodmer.
They also don't know anything about JP's crippling condition.
Sheriff's Department, open up!
The sheriff's deputies were just following the judge's directive.
I need you to come with us, sir.
What's this all about?
I'll explain later. Right now, I need you to come with us.
Oh, I can't go anywhere. I'm not resistant, guys. I just got into surgery. I can't. Guys, what is this about?
I believe that the devil used Holly to get to my family.
Now resist.
It was just so uncharacteristic for that neighborhood to have had this horrible thing happen.
Sheriff's Department, open up!
I can't imagine a neighborhood dispute turning out this way.
Mr. Miller?
Yes?
We need you to come with us, sir.
JP Villar is feeling the full effect of our neighbor Holly Bodmer's cruel misuse of power.
Guys, what's this?
Holly never treated JP. She never had any professional connection with him. She had no knowledge of his mental health or anything else that would entitle her to do this.
Right, guys, what's this all?
From where I sit, Holly did what she saw fit to take this to the next level. I'm almost surprised that it didn't happen sooner.
Holly believes JP is violent criminal John Villar. The sheriff's deputies don't know about her mistake. All they see is a man resisting arrest.
JP was screaming, he was calling for help, he was crying out. He was in physical pain because of his recent surgery. He asked the sheriff's call the Longboat Key police, who had a lot more experience with what was going on in the neighborhood. But once that Baker Act machinery is rolling, there's nothing you can do to get in the way.
Hey, you're hurting him!
The sheriff's office was more aggressive because of the details in the report. He's dangerous, drinking, and they acted with that information, which was just bad information.
They started pulling his arms in all different ways and twisting his back around.
And they struggled and had to physically manhandle him to get him in their vehicle.
I think at that point, Ted knew what was going on. I think he probably knew that Holly was behind it.
Is anybody home? Do you know if anybody's home yet? I just saw. Are you kidding me? Come on.
Erica and Laura arrive home to find the house empty and their neighbors upset.
They took JP away.
Who? The police. They just took him. They just took him 10 minutes ago.
Oh my God. Will you take care of Laura?
Yeah, of course.
We were both really confused. I had no idea what was going on.
Erica rushes to find her husband, but learns doctors at the mental health center declared him in no condition to be admitted.
He was complaining about his back pain and asking for some medical attention, so they took him to a nearby hospital.
Where is he? Where is my husband? JP?
I went in and I was like, just frantically searching. Where's my husband?
Okay. Oh my God. I'm here, baby.
And when he saw me, he burst out in tears.
How could she do this to you?
The ordeal has made JP's condition almost unbearable.
JP's back surgery had gone well and the recovery was going well, but this incident just kind of screwed up the healing process.
My dad was not a wussy guy. I mean, he was really strong and tough, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw him cry because he was in pain.
When JP returns home the next day, we see a man in agony.
One of the ironies of this case is that he never got the mental evaluation that he was forcibly taken away to get.
No evaluation. All of this was just, it was all for nothing.
This conflict between Holly and Ted and my parents took a huge physical and emotional toll on my dad. He was pretty much entirely immobile at this point.
There we go. Okay. Okay, let's put it right here.
Next door, Holly is unmoved.
Well, at this point, Holly seems to be throwing everything at JP. It's tough to know what Holly was thinking at the time. I mean, maybe going after the family is kind of the worst possible thing that she can do.
I saw Holly evolve into somebody I didn't know.
Within 24 hours, trouble is again at the Villars' doorstep.
I'm with Child Services. I need to speak with your daughter.
Someone called Child Protective Services, claiming that my dad was abusive to me and my mom.
Laura, can I ask you a few questions?
It's okay, baby. Go ahead.
To the Villars, the question of who made the call is painfully obvious.
Holly would have no reason to call Child Protective Services.
I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and I want
other than this was her plan from the beginning, to do whatever she could to get him off of that street.
You know that we're here to protect you, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
They interviewed JP, Erica, Laura, and they went away.
I hope you feel better, Mr. Villar.
Thank you.
Nothing was ever found that supported these allegations of abuse.
Holly Bodner tried to have him committed. Child Protective Services came to my house, and this all happened in 3 days, back to back to back. She really wanted to get us out.
How do you fight back when she's got all the power? The police are doing what she's asking them to do. The judges are doing what she's asking them to do.
There are very few people, if anyone I've run across, that are as dangerous as Holly Bodner.
I'll be okay, baby.
The toll of JP's new injuries is too great.
I love you, Daddy!
He is forced to have more surgery. Next door, Holly's ruthlessness proves too much for her partner, Ted Higbee.
It's too much.
Ted had to live by the rules of the owner of that house. And the owner of that house is Holly Bodner.
Over.
Ted was not very happy in the relationship with Holly. And he wanted out of that relationship.
It's hard to tell what was going through her mind at this point, how much of this was just kind of her starting to go off the rails.
I find that with delusional people, that they don't see that what they're doing is harmful to themselves as well.
For the Villars, things go from bad to worse when JP returns home from the hospital for a second time.
What is that, hun?
I think we're in a little bit of trouble, hon.
The Workman's Comp Insurance Company in New Jersey were able to take the position that JP has suffered a new injury that is no longer their responsibility. So all of his financial income gets terminated. So now he has no income and no health insurance.
How much more can this family take? They were so devastated.
What are we gonna do?
The Villars are now almost penniless and close to the breaking point.
I think they were all afraid. To think that an individual could figure out how to use the power she had to cause this to happen, what else could she do?
The next step Holly takes is the most drastic one yet.
She had to have a different personality going on at that time because it was nothing that I had ever seen previously, but I knew that it was bad.
It's tough to really know who somebody really is. And you find out a lot that underneath what appears to be a decent, solid, rational human being is somebody that has a lot of troubles.
When we heard sirens on the street, we all assumed they were coming for J.P. Villar. But they were for Holly Bodner.
We responded to a rescue call at Miss Bodner's residence in reference to an unresponsive person.
Holly, are you with me, Holly? Holly?
Paramedics on scene stated that they had found prescription pills that she had taken.
BP's not doing well. We need to get going.
Right.
I believe it was an overdose, but that didn't even surprise me. Maybe it's because I had some kind of insight when I met her. Something seemed very off.
Holly survives the ordeal, but neither she nor the neighborhood will ever be the same. Next door, we soon see life for the Villars take yet another drastic turn.
With workers' comp cut off, the Villars could no longer afford their rent and they were evicted. At that point, Holly got what she wanted. The Villars were out of the neighborhood. She had taken his health, she had taken his income, taken the roof from over his head.
I'm okay, babe. Thanks so much. Keys. Thanks so much, man.
Take it easy.
Bye, Dan.
You guys drive safe.
When they left, it was like tails between the legs, totally shattered, physically wounded, mentally broken.
The trio downsizes to a much smaller apartment, far away from everyone in Longboat Key.
What was going to be paradise to us turned out to be one of the worst experiences of our lives.
I felt extremely sorry for the whole family because not one of them deserved any of that. They were just such a nice family.
Come on, Pumpkin.
Holly believes the battle is won, but the lies she told to have JP committed finally come back to haunt her.
After an investigation, the prosecutor's office charged Holly with perjury for lying on the Baker Act form. There was no trial. Holly pleaded no contest to the charges, and she was sentenced to 10 weekends in jail. I think the Villars, for sure, found no justice in this. 10 weekends in jail.
To this day, we still don't know if Holly ever found out who her neighbor JP really was.
Even at her sentencing, she said that she was trying to protect herself from danger. Nowhere in this process did she say, I completely abused my position. I abused the power that the state of Florida has given me, and I kind of wrongfully had this guy taken away and had him injured.
Despite everything, the Villars hope they can put the whole ordeal behind them.
I felt a lot safer. I think, okay, our neighbors are the problem, and we got away from them.
I'm off to work, okay? Okay. So I'll see you.
Problem solved. Well, it didn't really work out like that. It was a pretty normal day. My mom went to work.
Thanks, baby. Thanks.
I stayed home with my dad, and he started to mumble something.
Daddy? Daddy, what's wrong? What's wrong? Daddy!
And I
What's wrong? What's wrong?
shook his shoulder.
Daddy! Dad! What's wrong?
He looked up at me briefly for a quick second, and then he closed his eyes. And he let out a breath, and his arm hit the ground. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, no, come back.
Daddy? Dad? Daddy?
JP succumbs to his injuries less than a year after moving out of Longboat Key.
Laura, 10 years old at the time, had to be there alone with him when he passed away. And my daughter lives with that every day.
JP died of a blood clot that the prosecutor's office in Manatee County and the Villar family believed was a direct result of him being Baker acted.
He had a back injury. Who dies from a back injury? Holly Bodner turned a manageable back injury into a situation that ultimately took his life.
I hope that she doesn't just forget that this all happened. I hope that she never does this to anyone else.
Holly is placed on 5 years probation by the Florida Board of Psychology to ensure that she can never abuse her power in this way again.
She ended up selling the house and moving away. What this story is really about is...
There is a place on the outskirts of Port Coquitlam where the air never quite settles. Even on calm nights, when the wind rests and the trees stand still, something lingers there, something heavy, something that refuses to be carried away. The locals used to joke about it. They would drive past the long dirt road, glance at the rusted gates, and shake their heads. Just a pig farm, they'd say. But no one ever stayed long enough to listen. Because if you had stood there, really stood there, past the noise of the highway, past the distant hum of the city, you might have noticed the silence was wrong. Not peaceful. Not empty. But thick. As if the land itself was holding its breath. For years, people came and went from that farm. Music echoed across the fields on weekend nights. Laughter spilled out into the darkness. Pickup trucks lined the gravel path. Men drank, shouted, stumbled through the mud. Women arrived too, some in groups, some alone, some never seen again. And still, nothing stopped it. Because far away, in another part of the city, those disappearances barely registered. In Vancouver's downtown east side, women vanished all the time. They disappeared between one streetlight and the next. Between a promise of money and the backseat of a stranger's car. Between addiction and survival. Names were whispered for a few days, maybe a week, then folded into silence. No headlines. No urgency. Just absence. An absence, in places like that, has a way of becoming normal. But normal can be a dangerous illusion. Because while families waited for phone calls that never came, while missing posters curled on damp telephone poles, something else was happening, quietly, methodically, just beyond the edge of attention. A man was counting. Not money. Not time. People. He moved through his days like anyone else. He fed animals. Fixed fences. Talked to neighbors. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't sound like one either. His voice was soft, almost awkward, the kind that made people underestimate him. But there was something behind his eyes. Not rage. Not even excitement. Just a kind of emptiness. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that doesn't stop. Years later, when investigators tried to piece it together, they struggled with the scale of it. The timeline stretched too long. The numbers didn't sit right. Every answer seemed to open into something worse. Because this wasn't a crime that happened in a moment. It unfolded slowly. Patiently. Like something growing beneath the surface. And by the time anyone truly saw it, it was already too late. The farm had been there all along. The parties had been loud. The rumors had circulated. And still, no one connected the dots in time. Or maybe they did, and chose not to look too closely. That's the part that unsettles people the most. Not just what happened on that land, but how long it was allowed to continue. How many chances there were to stop it. How many times someone could have asked one more question, followed one more lead, cared just a little bit more. Because evil doesn't always force its way in. Sometimes, it waits. It watches. It learns exactly where no one is looking. And then it builds something there. Something quiet. Something hidden. Something that can exist for years without interruption. Until one day, by accident more than intention, someone opens a door that was never meant to be opened. And everything spills out. In February of 2002, that door finally opened. Not because of the missing women. Not because of the rumors. Not even because of suspicion. But because of something smaller. Something almost routine. A warrant. A search. A detail that, on its own, didn't seem like it mattered. But it did. Because when investigators stepped onto that property, they weren't just entering a farm. They were stepping into a story that had been writing itself for over a decade. A story buried in soil, in silence, in the spaces between people who were never properly counted. What they would find there would stretch beyond anything they expected. Beyond anything they were prepared for. And as the evidence began to surface, piece by piece, a question emerged, one that would haunt the investigation, the trial, and the country itself. How does something like this happen without anyone stopping it? And more importantly, how many lives does it take before the world finally pays attention? This is the story of Robert Picton. But more than that, this is the story of the people he chose. The people the world almost forgot. And the silence that made everything possible. Long before anyone would call it a crime scene, the land in Port Coquitlam had a different kind of reputation. It wasn't notorious. It wasn't feared. It was simply overlooked, the way certain places are when they sit just far enough outside the rhythm of a city to be forgotten, but not far enough to feel entirely remote. It existed in that quiet in-between, where rules loosen, where attention fades, where things can happen without witnesses. The road leading to the farm was narrow and uneven, a stretch of gravel that seemed to resist visitors rather than welcome them. Tires crunched loudly as vehicles passed, the sound echoing across open fields before dissolving into the surrounding trees. On damp mornings, the fog would roll in low and thick, swallowing the outlines of buildings and fences until the entire property felt like it had been erased, replaced by something softer, less defined. By the time the sun burned through, the illusion would vanish, revealing a place that looked ordinary at a glance but unsettled anyone who stayed long enough to really see it. The farmhouse itself stood slightly off-center, weathered dulled by years of rain and neglect. Nearby structures leaned at odd angles, patched together in ways that suggested function mattered more than appearance. Rust crept across metal surfaces. Doors didn't quite close the way they should. Nothing about the place felt maintained in the traditional sense. It wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't cared for either. It existed in a kind of suspended state, where decay and use coexisted without ever fully resolving into one or the other. And then there were the pens. Rows of enclosures stretched across parts of the property, filled with pigs that moved restlessly through mud and straw. The smell was immediate, thick and sour, clinging to clothes and skin in a way that lingered long after someone left. It was the kind of scent people joked about when describing farm life, but here it felt heavier, almost oppressive. It settled into the air and stayed there, unmoving, as if it had nowhere else to go. To an outsider, it was just another rural operation, rough around the edges but not entirely unusual. Farms like this existed all over British Columbia, places where work was hard, margins were thin, and appearances didn't always matter. But there was something about this one that didn't quite align with that image. Something subtle. Something easy to dismiss, but difficult to ignore once it registered. People who visited would later struggle to describe it. They'd talk about the layout, the smell, the condition of the buildings. But eventually, their descriptions would drift into something less tangible. A feeling. A discomfort they couldn't explain at the time, only recognize in hindsight. Because the farm wasn't just a place of work. It was a place of gathering. On certain nights, the stillness would break. Vehicles would appear one by one, headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way down the gravel road. Music would follow, carried on the night air, mixing with laughter and the occasional shout. The property transformed during these hours, shifting from isolation to activity in a way that felt almost abrupt. Strangers moved freely across the land, drinks in hand, voices rising and falling as the night stretched on. These gatherings weren't hidden. Neighbors knew about them. Some even attended. They were described as wild, unpredictable, sometimes chaotic. But not criminal, not in any way that demanded immediate intervention. At least, not on the surface. And that surface mattered. Because it created a kind of camouflage. The noise, the movement, the constant flow of people, it blurred the boundaries of what was normal and what wasn't. Someone arriving late wouldn't stand out. Someone leaving early wouldn't raise questions. And someone disappearing altogether could be explained away in a dozen different ways, none of which required deeper investigation. That's where geography began to intertwine with something far more dangerous. About 30 kilometers away sat Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood that carried its own weight of history and hardship. It was a place where survival often came one day at a time, where addiction, poverty, and vulnerability intersected in ways that made people invisible to the wider world. Women in particular faced risks that were both immediate and constant. They navigated streets where trust was a luxury and safety was never guaranteed. In that environment, disappearance didn't always trigger alarm. It should have. But it didn't. A missed appointment could be explained. A lost phone. A temporary move. A decision to leave town without telling anyone. The possibilities stacked on top of each other, creating enough uncertainty to delay action, sometimes indefinitely. And delay, in cases like this, becomes something else entirely. It becomes permission. The distance between the downtown east side and the farm wasn't just physical. It was social. Emotional. Institutional. It represented a gap in attention, in resources, in urgency. What happened in one place didn't always carry weight in the other. And in that gap, patterns could form without being recognized. Women traveled that distance for many reasons. Some were offered money. Others were promised a place to stay, a chance to rest, a brief escape from the pressures of the street. The farm, with its parties and open access, didn't feel like a destination that required suspicion. It felt like an opportunity, however uncertain. Once there, the environment did the rest. The isolation meant fewer witnesses. The noise meant fewer questions. The condition of the property meant fewer expectations. Everything about the setting worked together to create a space where actions could unfold without immediate consequence. And at the center of it all was Robert Picton. He didn't stand out in the way people often imagine. There was no dramatic presence, no commanding personality that drew attention. If anything, he blended in too well. He moved through his own property with a kind of quiet familiarity, interacting with guests in a way that felt casual, almost forgettable. He wasn't the loudest voice at the party. He wasn't the one people watched. That role belonged to someone else. And that, perhaps, was part of the design. Because while others occupied the spotlight, he remained just outside of it, observing, choosing, waiting. The setting allowed for that. It provided cover not just in a physical sense, but in a social one. Expectations were lowered. Awareness was scattered. And in that environment, subtlety became an advantage. Over time, the farm developed a reputation. Not an official one. Not something documented or widely discussed. But something that circulated in conversations, in warnings passed quietly from one person to another. There were stories about things going missing. About people who didn't come back. About moments that felt off in ways that were hard to articulate. Some dismissed those stories. Others didn't. But even those who felt uneasy often returned. Because options were limited. Because survival required risk. Because sometimes, a bad situation still felt better than the alternative. That's the part that complicates everything. The setting wasn't just a backdrop. It was an active participant. It shaped decisions, influenced behavior, and created conditions where danger could exist alongside normalcy without immediately revealing itself. And for years, it worked. The farm remained standing. The parties continued. The flow of people never fully stopped. From the outside, it was easy to look at the property and see nothing more than a neglected piece of land with a rough reputation. But beneath that surface, something else was taking hold. Something that relied on time. On repetition. On the assumption that no one was paying close enough attention to see the pattern forming. Because patterns, once recognized, demand action. And action, in this case, would have meant stepping into a space that was easy to ignore. So the pattern continued. Quietly. Patiently. Until the setting itself could no longer contain what had been happening within it. Until the land, in its own silent way, began to give something back. Not answers. Not yet. But enough to suggest that this place, this overlooked, underestimated, carefully ignored place, had been holding onto something far more significant than anyone realized. And that whatever it wasn't going to stay hidden forever. In the downtown east side of Vancouver, mornings didn't begin with alarm clocks or sunlight filtering gently through curtains. They began with movement. Slow at first, then steady. People emerging from doorways, from shelters, from places that were never meant to be slept in. The sidewalks filled with life that didn't quite feel like living, but persisted anyway, stubbornly, day after day. It was a place where names mattered deeply to those who carried them, but not always to the world outside. Faces became familiar within a few blocks, then disappeared beyond them. Stories overlapped, tangled together in ways that made it difficult to separate one life from another. And yet, each person there carried something entirely their own. A past that led them here. A version of themselves that existed before the streets, before survival became the central task of every day. Among them were women who moved through this environment with a kind of practiced awareness. They knew which corners were safer, which people could be trusted, which risks were worth taking and which weren't. But knowledge didn't always translate into safety. It simply shifted the odds. Some of these women had families who still waited for them. Mothers who kept their phones close at night. Sisters who replayed old conversations, searching for something they might have missed. Children who asked questions that didn't have answers. Others had lost those connections over time, not because they didn't matter, but because life had a way of stretching distance into something harder to cross. They were not invisible. But they were treated as if they were. And that difference, between being unseen and being ignored, would shape everything that followed. There was a pattern to their days, though it rarely looked the same twice. Mornings might involve finding food, securing a place to rest, navigating the complex web of services that offered help but often required more stability than anyone could provide. Afternoons blurred into evenings, and evenings into nights, when the stakes rose and the choices narrowed. Work, for many, wasn't a matter of preference. It was a matter of necessity. Standing under streetlights, leaning against walls, watching cars slow down just enough to signal interest. Conversations that lasted seconds, decisions made in moments. The exchange was simple on the surface, but layered with risk beneath it. Every interaction carried unknowns. Every choice had consequences that couldn't always be predicted. And yet, there was still laughter. Still moments of connection. Shared cigarettes. Stories told in fragments. Jokes that made no sense to anyone outside that world but meant everything within it. Humanity persisted in ways that were quiet but undeniable. It's important to understand that. Because when people later tried to reduce these women to statistics, to numbers in a report, they erased the very thing that made their loss so profound. Each one had a name, a voice, a way of moving through the world that was entirely their own. Some dreamed of leaving, of finding stability, reconnecting with family, starting over somewhere new. Others focused on getting through the next day, the next hour, the next moment. Both approaches required strength. Both were valid. And both existed side by side. The downtown East Side was not just a place of hardship. It was a place of contradiction, of resilience and vulnerability existing in the same breath, of people who had been pushed to the margins but refused to disappear entirely. That refusal mattered. But it wasn't always enough. Because beyond the boundaries of that neighborhood, perception shifted. The same women who were known, who were cared about, who were part of a community, became something else in the eyes of the broader public. They became distant, abstract, easier to overlook. So when someone didn't show up one day, the reaction depended on where you were standing. On the street, it was noticed immediately. Have you seen her? When was the last time anyone talked to her? Questions moved quickly, passed from one person to another, building a picture that was incomplete but urgent. There was concern, real and immediate, but it often stayed within the confines of that community. Outside of it, the response was different. Slower. Less certain. Sometimes absent altogether. And that gap, between concern and action, created space. Space where time could pass without answers. Space where patterns could form without being acknowledged. Space where someone could vanish, and the world would take too long to realize they were gone. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, it was one woman. Then another. Then a name that sounded familiar because it had been mentioned before, in a similar context, under similar circumstances. People began to notice. Not in an official capacity, not in reports or statistics, but in conversations. In the way certain corners felt emptier. In the absence of voices that had once been constant. There was a growing sense that something wasn't right. But sensing something and proving it are two very different things. And proof requires attention. It requires resources. It requires a willingness to look closely at lives that society has already decided not to prioritize. That willingness was slow to come. In the meantime, the women continued to live their lives as they always had. They navigated risks, made choices, formed connections. They laughed, argued, hoped, and endured. They were more than the circumstances that surrounded them. But those circumstances mattered. Because they shaped how the world responded when something went wrong. And something was going wrong. The distance between the downtown East Side and the farm in Port Coquitlam was not just measured in kilometers. It was measured in perception. In value assigned to certain lives over others. In the unspoken assumptions that influenced which cases were pursued with urgency and which were allowed to linger. Women traveled the distance for reasons that made sense in the moment. An offer of money. A chance to get away from the streets, even temporarily. A situation that seemed manageable, or at least no more dangerous than the alternatives. They made decisions based on the information they had. What they didn't have was the full picture. What they couldn't see was how those individual choices were beginning to connect, forming a pattern that stretched beyond any single person's experience. That pattern would only become clear much later. After the fact. After the damage had already been done. And when it did, people would look back and ask how it was possible that so many women could disappear without immediate, decisive action. But that question, while important, comes too late for those at the center of the story. Because for them, this was never about patterns or investigations or systems. It was about survival. About making it through another day. About holding on to pieces of themselves in a world that constantly tried to take them away. They were daughters. Friends. Mothers. Sisters. They had favorite songs, memories they returned to, small things that brought comfort in difficult moments. They had histories that mattered, even if those histories were not widely known. And they had futures. Or at least, they should have. That's the part that often gets lost. The sense of what was taken, not just in terms of life, but in terms of possibility. The paths that were never explored. The changes that might have happened. The moments that will never exist. When we talk about victims, it's easy to focus on the end. But the end is only one part of the story. What came before matters just as much. Maybe more. Because it reminds us that these were not just people who were lost. They were people who lived. Who mattered. Who should have been seen, heard, and protected in ways that didn't depend on where they lived or how they survived. And as the story moves forward, as the investigation begins to take shape, as names start to appear in reports and evidence begins to surface, it's important to hold on to that understanding. Because without it, the narrative becomes incomplete. And incompleteness, in a case like this, is exactly what allowed it to continue for as long as it did. Night didn't fall gently on the road leading out of Vancouver. It arrived in layers, dimming the edges of buildings first, then swallowing entire blocks until only scattered pockets of light remained. In the downtown east side, those pockets mattered. They defined where people stood, where deals were made, where eyes could still see what was coming. On one of those nights, the air carried a damp chill, the kind that crept into clothing and stayed there. Streetlights flickered faintly above cracked sidewalks, illuminating figures that moved in practiced patterns. Conversations were short, movements efficient. Time, in that space, wasn't measured in hours but in opportunities. A car slowed. It didn't stop immediately. It never did. It rolled forward just enough to signal interest, just enough to invite attention without committing to it. Inside, a silhouette. Indistinct. Unremarkable. The kind that blended into memory the moment it passed. But this time, it didn't pass. The window lowered slightly. A few words exchanged. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would stand out to anyone watching from a distance. The woman who stepped closer had done this before. She understood the rhythm of these interactions, the balance between caution and necessity. Money was mentioned. A destination suggested. Not far, just outside the city. A place where things could happen without interruption. The offer wasn't extraordinary. It didn't need to be. It just needed to be enough. She hesitated, but only for a moment. Because hesitation was part of the process, not a refusal. It was a calculation, a quick assessment of risk versus reward. The night was cold. The options were limited. The decision, in the end, followed a familiar path. She got into the car. The door closed with a muted thud, sealing the moment in a way that felt final, though no one present would have recognized it as such. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging back into the slow flow of traffic before turning toward the outskirts of the city. Behind them, life continued as it always did. Another car approached. Another conversation began. No one marked the departure as anything more than routine. The drive out of Vancouver was quiet. Streetlights thinned, replaced by stretches of darkness broken only by the occasional passing vehicle. The city's noise faded gradually, replaced by something softer, less defined. The kind of silence that settles when there's nothing left to fill it. Inside the car, conversation came in fragments. Questions that didn't demand real answers. Responses that revealed little. It wasn't about connection. It never was. It was about transaction, about reaching a destination where the agreed-upon exchange could take place. But there was something off. Not immediately. Not in a way that would trigger alarm. Just small details that didn't quite align. The route taken. The lack of urgency. The way the driver's attention seemed divided, as if focused on something beyond the immediate task. Still, the car kept moving. The road narrowed. Gravel replaced pavement. Tires crunched as the vehicle slowed, turning onto a path that felt less traveled, less defined. The headlights cut through darkness, revealing glimpses of fencing, open land, structures that appeared and disappeared too quickly to fully register. Then, the farm. At night, it looked different. Larger somehow, its boundaries less clear. Shadows stretched across the ground, blending objects together until it was difficult to distinguish one from another. The air carried a smell that was stronger here, heavier, something organic and persistent. The car came to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine cut out. Silence settled, broken only by distant, indistinct sounds that could have been animals, could have been something else entirely. The woman stepped out, her movements cautious but controlled. This was unfamiliar territory, but not unprecedented. She had been to places like this before, places where the rules were different but still navigable. The man moved around the front of the vehicle, his figure briefly illuminated before slipping back into shadow. Up close, there was nothing overtly threatening about him. No raised voice, no sudden aggression. Just a presence that felt detached. He gestured toward one of the buildings. Inside, the air was warmer, but no more comfortable. The space was cluttered, objects arranged without clear order. It looked lived in, but not in a way that suggested care or attention. More like accumulation, things added over time without ever being removed. The door closed behind them. And something shifted. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment that could be pointed to as the turning point. Instead, it was a series of small changes. A tone that became flatter. A movement that lingered a second too long. A sense that the situation was no longer following the expected path. Confusion came first. Then unease. The kind that starts in the background, easy to ignore, until it moves forward, demanding attention. The woman adjusted her stance, her awareness sharpening. She had learned to read situations quickly, to recognize when something was wrong. And something was wrong. What followed didn't unfold in a way that allowed for escape. Control was established not through chaos, but through precision. Movements that limited options. Actions that closed off exits. The space itself became a factor, its layout working against anyone unfamiliar with it. Outside, the night remained unchanged. The same darkness. The same stillness. No interruption. No indication that anything inside the building had shifted from routine to something else entirely. Time, in moments like these, behaves differently. It stretches. Compresses. Loses its usual meaning. What might have taken minutes felt longer, heavier, each second carrying more weight than the last. And within that altered sense of time, the reality of the situation became clear. This was not a transaction. This was not a temporary encounter. This was something else. Something final. There are details that remain unknown, pieces of the sequence that were never fully reconstructed. What is known comes from fragments, from evidence gathered later, from patterns identified after the fact. But the absence of complete information doesn't lessen the impact of what occurred. It only adds to it. Because it leaves space for questions that will never be answered. What was said? What was thought? What might have been different if one choice had changed, if one moment had unfolded another way? Those questions linger. But the outcome does not. At some point, the struggle ended. The movement stopped. And the space, once again, became still. The man remained. Moving through the aftermath with the same detached focus that had defined his actions before. There was no visible hesitation, no indication of reflection. Just a process, carried out with a familiarity that suggested repetition. Outside, the farm continued to exist as it always had. The animals shifted in their enclosures. The air held its heavy scent. The building stood in quiet disrepair. Nothing about the environment signaled what had just taken place within it. And that was the most unsettling part. Because the incident did not disrupt the setting. It blended into it. Became part of it. Another event absorbed into a space that had been shaped, over time, to contain such things without revealing them. Later, when investigators would attempt to piece together these incidents, they would find themselves confronting not just individual acts, but a system. A way of operating that relied on consistency, on predictability, on the assumption that each event would remain isolated, unconnected. And for a long time, that assumption held. The woman who entered the car did not return. Her absence joined others, forming a pattern that was still too diffuse to demand immediate recognition. Her name, like theirs, would be spoken in certain circles, questioned, remembered, but not yet fully understood. Not yet placed within the larger context that would eventually emerge. Because at this point in the story, the incidents were still just that. Separate. Unlinked. Each one carrying its own weight, but not yet forming the shape of something bigger. That shape would come later. When the pieces began to align. When the connections could no longer be ignored. When the space that had hidden everything for so long would finally begin to reveal what it had been holding. But for now, the night ended the way it always did. Quietly. Without witnesses. Without interruption. Leaving behind nothing but absence. February 2002 did not arrive with any sense of revelation. It came the way most months do on the outskirts of Port Coquitlam, cold, damp, and unremarkable. The ground held onto winter's chill, mud clung to boots, and the sky hovered in that familiar grey that made it difficult to tell where morning ended and afternoon began. Nothing about those days suggested that anything significant was about to surface. And that's how it often begins. Not with urgency. Not with a breakthrough. But with something routine. The investigation that led officers to the farm had nothing to do with missing women. It wasn't driven by years of quiet disappearances or the growing unease in Vancouver's downtown east side. It started with a separate concern, something smaller on the surface, something procedural. A warrant. A search related to illegal firearms. It was the kind of task that didn't usually make headlines, the kind that officers carried out with practiced efficiency. You arrive, you secure the property, you look for what you came to find, and you leave. There's a structure to it, a predictability that keeps things controlled. But control has its limits. When officers first approached the property, nothing immediately signaled what they would eventually uncover. The farm looked as it always had, weathered, disorganized, marked by years of use without care. The same buildings. The same enclosures. The same heavy air that settled over everything. If anything, it felt like another day on a job that would soon be forgotten. They stepped onto the land with a clear objective. Locate weapons. Document evidence. Move on. Inside the buildings, the environment was exactly what you would expect from a place like this. Cluttered spaces filled with tools, equipment, personal belongings that had accumulated over time. Nothing was arranged for appearance. Everything existed for function, even if that function wasn't immediately clear. The search began methodically. Drawers opened. Containers inspected. Rooms moved through one by one. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Items that raised minor concerns, details that might support the original warrant, but nothing that shifted the direction of the investigation. It was proceeding as expected. Until it wasn't. The first indication came not as a discovery, but as a discrepancy. Something that didn't belong. Something that didn't fit the context of the search. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when suspicion turns into realization, because it rarely happens all at once. It builds. Piece by piece. A detail here. An inconsistency there. Each one small enough to dismiss on its own, but together forming something that demands attention. An item that suggested a presence beyond the obvious. A trace that couldn't be easily explained. A sense that the space held more than it was showing. Officers slowed their pace. The search became more deliberate. What had been routine began to shift into something else. Because once you notice one thing, you start to look differently at everything. And when they did, more began to surface. Personal belongings that didn't align with the people known to frequent the property. Items that suggested ownership by individuals who were not present, who had no clear connection to the farm beyond the possibility that they had been there at some point. Clothing. Accessories. Objects that carry identity in subtle ways. Individually, they could be explained. People lose things. Leave them behind. Forget them. In a place known for gatherings, for movement, for a constant flow of visitors, such items wouldn't immediately raise alarm. But there were too many. And they were found in places that didn't make sense. Not in shared spaces. Not in areas where guests would naturally leave belongings. But in locations that felt hidden, displaced, as if they had been moved there intentionally. That's when the search changed. What had been a firearms investigation began to expand, not officially at first, but in the minds of the officers moving through the space. They started to consider possibilities that hadn't been part of the original plan. They started to question what they were seeing. And more importantly, what they weren't. Because absence, in a place like this, can be as telling as presence. There were signs of activity, of use, of life moving through the property. But there were also gaps. Spaces that felt too empty, too controlled, as if something had been removed rather than never there at all. The ground itself became a point of interest. Uneven patches. Areas that looked disturbed, then settled. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would immediately stand out to someone not paying close attention. But once noticed, difficult to ignore. The decision to dig deeper, literally and figuratively, didn't come lightly. Expanding a search requires justification. It requires a shift in focus, in resources, in intent. But by that point, the accumulation of small details had reached a threshold. There was enough to warrant a closer look. And that closer look changed everything. As forensic teams became involved, the process slowed even further. Every inch of the property began to matter. Every object, every surface, every section of ground was treated as potential evidence. What had once been a farm transformed into something else entirely. A site of investigation. A space where the past was no longer hidden, but waiting to be uncovered. The first confirmed pieces of evidence didn't arrive with clarity. They arrived with uncertainty. Biological traces that required analysis. Samples that needed to be processed, compared, understood. Time stretched again, but in a different way now. Not the slow passage of unnoticed years, but the tense waiting that follows a discovery that hasn't yet revealed its full meaning. When the results came back, they didn't answer questions. They created them. DNA. Not one source. Not two. Multiple. Each profile representing a person. A presence. A life that had intersected with this property in a way that could no longer be dismissed as incidental. That's when the scope became undeniable. This was no longer about firearms. This was no longer a contained investigation. This was something larger. Something that reached beyond the boundaries of the farm and into the city, into the community where women had been disappearing for years. The connection, once made, felt both shocking and inevitable. Because the signs had been there. The reports. The patterns. The names that had surfaced, then faded. Now, they had a location. A focal point. A place where those separate threads began to converge. As more evidence was collected, the picture grew darker. The number of individuals potentially connected to the site increased. Personal items were catalogued, each one carrying the weight of identification, of confirmation, of loss. Families who had been waiting for answers were suddenly faced with a different kind of reality. Not uncertainty, but possibility. And possibility, in this context, was devastating. Because it meant that the absence they had been living with might finally be explained. But not in the way they had hoped. The farm became a controlled space, sealed off from the outside world. Media attention began to build, though details were limited at first. What could be shared was carefully managed, both to protect the integrity of the investigation and to avoid causing unnecessary panic. But within the investigative teams, there was no ambiguity. They understood what they were dealing with. Not just in terms of evidence, but in terms of scale. This was not a single incident. Not an isolated event. This was a pattern that had been allowed to continue for years, possibly longer than anyone was ready to accept. And the realization of that carried its own weight. Because it forced a question that no one wanted to answer. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? The discovery didn't just reveal what had happened on the farm. It exposed the gaps that had allowed it to happen. The delays. The missed connections. The assumptions that had prevented earlier intervention. Each piece of evidence was not just a clue, but a reflection of those failures. And as the investigation expanded, as more resources were brought in, as the full extent of the site was explored, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. What had been uncovered so far was significant. But it was not complete. The land still held more. The buildings still concealed details. The process of uncovering everything would take time. Years, in fact. Because when something has been hidden for that long, it doesn't reveal itself all at once. It comes in fragments. In layers. Each one adding to a picture that becomes harder to face with every new piece. And at the center of it all was a man who had lived on this property, moved through it daily, interacted with others as if nothing was out of place. A man whose name would soon become known far beyond the boundaries of this farm. Robert Picton. But at this stage, the focus was not on him. Not yet. Because before there could be accountability, there had to be understanding. Before there could be justice, there had to be evidence. And the evidence was still emerging, still being uncovered, still forcing those involved to confront a reality that was far more complex, far more disturbing, than anyone had anticipated. The discovery had opened the door. But what lay beyond it was still unfolding. Slowly. Relentlessly. And with each passing day, it became harder to ignore the truth that had been buried there for so long. Once the farm was no longer just a property but a crime scene, the rhythm of everything changed. What had once been contained within the boundaries of Port Coquitlam began to expand outward, stretching into Vancouver, into old case files, into memories that had been dismissed or forgotten. The investigation did not move forward in a straight line. It spread, unevenly at first, like something trying to find its shape. The immediate priority was control. The land had to be secured, documented, processed with a level of precision that left no room for oversight. But even as that work continued, another process began in parallel, one that reached back into the past, pulling forward every report of a missing woman that had ever crossed a desk and failed to gain traction. Names resurfaced. Dates were revisited. Patterns that had once seemed too thin to pursue began to take on new weight. Investigators sat with files that had been closed, reopened them, and read them differently this time. What had previously been treated as isolated disappearances now carried the possibility of connection. Locations, timelines, descriptions of last known movements, details that had once been fragmented started to align in subtle, unsettling ways. The downtown east side became central to that effort. Officers who had worked in the area for years found themselves retracing familiar ground, but with a different perspective. Conversations that had once felt routine now carried significance. Witnesses who had spoken before were approached again, asked the same questions in new ways, encouraged to recall details that might not have seemed important at the time. Memory is an imperfect tool. It shifts. It fades. But under the pressure of new context, it can also sharpen. People began to remember things differently. A vehicle that had been seen more than once. A man who had appeared unremarkable at the time but now felt out of place in retrospect. A pattern of offers that seemed consistent, almost rehearsed. None of it was definitive on its own. But together, it began to form a direction. That direction led, again and again, back to the same place. The farm. And the man who lived there. Robert Picton. At first, he was one of several individuals connected to the property, not yet isolated as the central figure. The investigation cast a wide net, as it had to. Anyone who had regular access to the land, anyone who had been present during the years in question, anyone who had interacted with the women now being identified as potential victims, all of them were considered. Associates were interviewed. Employees. Friends. People who had attended the parties, who had spent time on the property, who had seen things that might have seemed insignificant at the time. The responses varied. Some were cooperative, offering what they could, trying to piece together memories that had long since settled into the background of their lives. Others were less forthcoming, their recollections vague, their willingness to engage limited. And then there were those who seemed genuinely unaware of anything beyond what had been visible on the surface. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling aspect. The possibility that something so extensive could exist alongside ordinary interactions without being fully recognized. Investigators faced a challenge that went beyond gathering evidence. They had to reconstruct a timeline that spanned over a decade, involving individuals whose lives were not consistently documented, whose movements were not always recorded, whose absences were not immediately reported. It required patience. And persistence. And a willingness to sit with uncertainty. The forensic work on the farm continued, generating a steady flow of data that needed to be processed, analyzed, and integrated into the broader investigation. DNA profiles were compared against missing persons databases, against known individuals, against anything that might provide identification. Each match brought clarity. And weight. Because every confirmed identity was not just a piece of evidence, but a person. A life that had been reduced to fragments and now had to be reassembled in a way that could stand up in court. At the same time, investigators began to build a profile of behavior. Not in the abstract, but grounded in the specifics of what had been uncovered. The selection of victims. The locations. The methods suggested by the evidence. Patterns of movement between the downtown east side and the farm. It pointed toward a level of consistency that was difficult to ignore. This was not random. It was structured. Repetitive. Deliberate. And that raised the stakes of the investigation. Because proving a single act is one thing. Establishing a pattern of acts over time requires a different level of evidence. A different level of certainty. As the focus narrowed, attention returned more directly to Picton himself. His daily routines, his interactions, his history with the property and the people who frequented it, all of it came under scrutiny. Interviews were conducted, statements taken, details cross-referenced against the growing body of evidence. He did not present as someone under pressure. Accounts described him as calm, even passive. There was no overt defensiveness, no visible attempt to control the narrative. If anything, his demeanor made it more difficult to reconcile the person being observed with the actions being investigated. That disconnect became part of the challenge. Because juries respond to perception. And perception is shaped not just by evidence, but by the way a person carries themselves, the way they speak, the way they appear in the absence of accusation. Investigators had to ensure that the case they were building did not rely on assumptions or impressions. It had to be grounded. Concrete. Unambiguous. That meant returning, again and again, to the evidence. To the land. To the items recovered. To the biological traces that tied individuals to the property in ways that could not be explained by coincidence alone. But even with that, there were obstacles. Legal thresholds. Procedural requirements. The need to establish not just presence, but responsibility. And in a case of this scale, with this level of complexity, those requirements became even more demanding. There were moments when the investigation seemed to stall, not because progress had stopped, but because the path forward required time. Analysis had to be completed. Reports had to be written. Connections had to be verified before they could be acted upon. During those periods, frustration grew. Not just within the investigative teams, but among families, among communities that had been waiting for answers long before the farm was ever searched. For them, every delay felt personal. Every unanswered question carried the weight of years already lost. And that pressure was felt. It pushed the investigation forward, but it also required balance. Moving too quickly risked mistakes. Moving too slowly risked losing trust. Somewhere in between, the work continued. Leads were followed, even when they led nowhere. Tips were evaluated, some proving useful, others fading under scrutiny. The process was exhaustive by necessity because the consequences of getting it wrong were too significant. And slowly, the picture became clearer. Not complete. Not yet. But clearer. The number of individuals potentially connected to the case grew. The timeline extended. The pattern, once faint, now stood out with increasing definition. It was no longer a question of whether something had happened. It was a question of how much. And how it had been allowed to continue. As investigators moved closer to formal charges, the focus sharpened. The evidence selected for prosecution had to meet a standard that would withstand challenge, that would hold under examination, that would translate the complexity of the case into something a court could process. Not every detail could be included. Not every connection could be pursued within that framework. Choices had to be made. Difficult ones. Because each decision about what to include also meant deciding what to leave aside, at least for the time being. That reality created its own tension. Between the desire to represent the full scope of what had occurred and the practical need to build a case that could result in conviction. In the end, the investigation moved forward with that balance in mind. Charges were prepared. Evidence organized. The groundwork laid for what would become one of the most significant trials in Canadian history. But even as that transition began, even as the focus shifted toward the courtroom, the investigation itself did not truly end. Because the questions it raised extended beyond any single case. Beyond any single individual. They reached into the systems that had responded, or failed to respond, over the years. They forced a broader examination of how cases like this are handled, how patterns are recognized, how lives are valued. And those questions would not be answered quickly. Some of them are still being asked. But at this point in the story, the investigation had reached a threshold. The evidence was no longer just a collection of fragments. It was a case. A case that would soon be presented, challenged, and judged. A case that carried with it not just the details of what had been uncovered on that farm, but the weight of everything that had led to that moment. And everything that would follow. By the time the investigation reached its most critical phase, the case was no longer defined by what was missing. It was defined by what had begun to surface. Patterns had taken shape, names had been connected, and the farm in Port Coquitlam had transformed from a place of suspicion into the center of something undeniable. But even then, there was still a distance between knowing and proving. And in that distance, the case either holds or collapses. Investigators understood that what they had was significant. The volume of evidence alone suggested a scale that was difficult to comprehend. But scale, by itself, does not secure a conviction. It can overwhelm. It can confuse. It can introduce doubt if it isn't carefully structured. What they needed now was clarity. A way to take everything they had uncovered and shape it into something precise, something that could withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. That meant focusing. Narrowing the scope without losing the truth. And finding the point where evidence, behavior, and accountability intersected in a way that could not be dismissed. The breakthrough did not come as a single moment of revelation. It emerged through accumulation, through the steady layering of forensic results, witness statements, and analytical work that had been building for months. Each piece had been processed individually, but now they were being brought together, compared, aligned. And when they were, something shifted. The DNA evidence, which had once been a collection of profiles, began to tell a more cohesive story. Multiple individuals, previously listed as missing from Vancouver's downtown east side, were now directly connected to the same location. Not through circumstance. Not through coincidence. But through physical presence in a space that had no reasonable explanation for containing those traces. That alone was powerful. But it wasn't enough. Because presence does not automatically establish responsibility. So the investigation pushed further. They examined the context of those findings. Where exactly the evidence had been recovered. How it had been preserved. What conditions would have been required for it to exist in those forms, in those locations. Each answer tightened the framework, reduced the number of alternative explanations. At the same time, witness testimony began to take on new significance. Individuals who had once described visits to the farm in vague terms were now able to place themselves, and others, within a more defined timeline. They recalled specific nights, specific interactions, details that had once seemed ordinary but now carried weight. A vehicle seen repeatedly. A pattern of offers made to women in the downtown east side. A man who did not stand out at first, but whose presence became more consistent the more closely it was examined. That man was Robert Picton. As his name moved from the periphery to the center of the investigation, the focus sharpened further. His routines were mapped. His access to the property was established beyond question. His interactions with individuals connected to the case were documented, cross-referenced, verified. There were no gaps in his proximity to the evidence. He was not someone who visited occasionally. He was not someone who could plausibly claim distance. He lived there. Worked there. Moved through the same spaces where the evidence had been found. And that proximity began to close the distance between suspicion and accountability. But even then, the case required something more. A moment where the abstract became concrete. A point where the narrative could no longer be interpreted in multiple ways. That point came through a combination of forensic interpretation and behavioral consistency. Experts examined the evidence not just as isolated findings, but as indicators of process. The way materials had been handled. The way traces had been distributed. The absence of certain elements where they would normally be expected, and the presence of others where they should not have been. It suggested control. It suggested repetition. It suggested that what had happened on that property was not accidental, not impulsive, but structured in a way that reflected planning and familiarity. And that interpretation aligned with the broader pattern. The selection of victims. The method of approach. The use of the farm as a location removed from immediate oversight. Everything pointed in the same direction. Not conclusively on its own, but collectively, overwhelmingly. The breakthrough was not a discovery of something new. It was the realization that everything already found could now be connected. That the fragments had formed a whole. And that the whole told a story that was both coherent and deeply disturbing. At that stage, the investigation crossed a threshold. It was no longer about exploring possibilities. It was about preparing for prosecution. Charges were finalized based on the strongest, most defensible evidence. 6 counts of murder were selected for trial, not because they represented the full extent of what had occurred, but because they provided the clearest path to conviction. Each count was supported by forensic findings that directly tied the victims to the property, to the environment, to circumstances that could not be explained away. It was a strategic decision. One that acknowledged the limits of what could be proven within a single trial, while still addressing the gravity of the case. Behind that decision was an understanding that justice, in this context, would not be complete. It could not be. But it could be established. And that mattered. As the case moved toward court, the breakthrough continued to resonate in another way. It changed how the story was understood. For years, the disappearances had been treated as separate events, each one tragic but isolated. Now, they were seen as part of a larger pattern, one that had been operating in plain sight, obscured not by complexity, but by the absence of connection. That shift had consequences. It forced institutions to confront their own responses. It raised questions about how many opportunities had been missed, how many warning signs had gone unrecognized or unaddressed. But those questions, while important, existed alongside something more immediate. The need to present the case. To take what had been uncovered and place it in a setting where it could be examined, challenged, and ultimately judged. The breakthrough had provided the foundation. Now, it would be tested. Because in a courtroom, evidence is not just presented. It is questioned. It is dissected. It is subjected to standards that leave no room for assumption. And the case against Robert Pickton would have to withstand all of it. Every detail. Every connection. Every conclusion drawn from years of investigation. As preparations continued, those involved understood the significance of what lay ahead. This was not just another trial. It was the culmination of an investigation that had exposed not only a series of crimes, but a series of failures. Failures to see. Failures to act. Failures to connect what should have been connected long before. The breakthrough had changed that. It had forced recognition. It had brought clarity where there had been uncertainty. And it had set the stage for the next phase of the story. A phase where the focus would shift from uncovering the truth to proving it. Where the evidence would speak, and the system would respond. And where, for the first time, the man at the center of it all would be required to answer for what had been found. The courtroom did not feel like the farm. It couldn't. Where the farm had been open, chaotic, layered with years of neglect and silence, the courtroom was controlled. Structured. Every movement observed, every word recorded, every detail confined within rules that demanded order. It was a place designed to bring clarity to chaos, to take something sprawling and reduce it into something that could be understood, debated, and ultimately decided. But not everything fits neatly into that structure. And this case, from the very beginning, resisted simplicity. When the trial of Robert Pickton began, the weight of it was already present. Not just in the evidence, but in the people who filled the room. Families who had waited years for answers. Investigators who had spent countless hours assembling a case from fragments. Observers who understood that what was about to unfold was not just a legal process, but a moment of reckoning. The charges brought forward focused on 6 counts of murder. 6 names. 6 lives selected not because they were the only ones affected, but because their cases could be proven with the strongest evidence available. It was a decision shaped by strategy, by the need to present a case that could withstand the demands of the legal system. But even within that limitation, everyone in the room understood that the scope extended far beyond those 6. That understanding lingered beneath everything. It shaped the atmosphere. It influenced the way each piece of evidence was received. Because nothing presented in that courtroom existed in isolation. Every detail carried the suggestion of something larger. The prosecution began by establishing the foundation. They did not rush. They couldn't afford to. Each element of the case had to be introduced carefully, methodically, building a narrative that was grounded in evidence rather than assumption. They walked the jury through the investigation, through the discovery of the farm, through the forensic work that had connected the victims to that property in ways that could not be dismissed. The DNA evidence was central. It was precise. Unemotional. A series of scientific findings that spoke in probabilities and matches, in sequences that aligned with known profiles. It did not speculate. It did not interpret beyond its limits. It simply stated what was present. And what was present was undeniable. Multiple victims, all linked to the same location. Not through casual contact. Not through circumstances that could be easily explained. But through evidence that suggested proximity to acts that had ended their lives. The jury listened. Carefully. Because understanding this case required attention. It required following details that were technical, sometimes difficult to grasp, but essential to the larger picture. The prosecution supplemented that evidence with testimony. Witnesses who had been part of the environment surrounding the farm. Individuals who had seen Pickton, who had interacted with him, who had observed patterns that now carried new meaning. Their accounts varied in clarity, in detail, in reliability, but together they added texture to the case. They described the property, the gatherings, the movement of people in and out of the space. They spoke of things that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt different when placed within the context of the evidence. Each testimony added a layer, not always definitive on its own, but contributing to a narrative that was becoming harder to challenge. Then came the defense. Their role was not to prove an alternative version of events. It was to introduce doubt, to question the certainty of the prosecution's case, to examine every piece of evidence and ask whether it could be interpreted differently. They focused on the gaps, on what could not be conclusively established. They raised questions about how the evidence had been collected, about the possibility of contamination, about the presence of other individuals on the property who could have been responsible for what had occurred. They pointed to the nature of the farm itself, a place where many people came and went, a place where items could be moved, where evidence could be transferred without direct involvement. They asked the jury to consider whether the presence of DNA alone was enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a necessary argument, because the burden of proof in a case like this is high. It has to be. And the defense's task was to ensure that burden was met. The trial moved forward in this tension, between assertion and doubt, between evidence and interpretation. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, each session adding to the complexity, to the weight of what the jury was being asked to decide. Throughout it all, Picton remained a constant presence. His demeanor did not shift dramatically. He did not react in ways that drew attention. He sat, listened, existed within the process without visibly engaging with it. For some, that absence of reaction was unsettling. For others, it was irrelevant. Because in the end, the case would not be decided by perception. It would be decided by evidence, and whether that evidence met the standard required for conviction. As the trial approached its conclusion, both sides presented their final arguments. The prosecution returned to the core of their case. They reminded the jury of the consistency of the evidence, of the way each element supported the others, of the lack of any plausible explanation that could account for the findings without placing responsibility on Picton. They emphasized the patterns, the connections, the accumulation of details that, taken together, formed a picture that was clear and cohesive. The defense, in turn, reiterated the importance of doubt. They reminded the jury that certainty must be established, not assumed. That the consequences of their decision were irreversible. That if there was any reasonable alternative explanation, it had to be considered. Then, the case was placed in the hands of the jury. Deliberation is a quiet process. It happens behind closed doors, removed from the public, from the families, from the individuals who have been part of the trial. It is where evidence is weighed, where arguments are reconsidered, where decisions are formed not through performance, but through discussion. Time passed. And then, the verdict. Guilty. 6 counts of second-degree murder. The words, when spoken, did not carry emotion. They did not need to. Their meaning was already understood. For the families, the verdict was not closure. It could not be. But it was something. Recognition. Confirmation. An acknowledgement that what had been suspected, what had been feared, what had been uncovered through years of investigation, had now been established within the system designed to judge it. Picton was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was the maximum penalty available under the law. And with that sentence, the trial reached its formal conclusion. But the case did not end. The remaining charges, those not brought to trial, were eventually stayed. A decision made within the legal framework, based on the understanding that the sentence already imposed represented the most severe outcome possible. It was a practical resolution, but one that left a sense of incompleteness. because the number of victims officially recognized in court did not reflect the number believed to be connected to the case. That gap remained. And it continues to shape how the case is remembered. Justice, in this instance, was both achieved and limited. Achieved in the sense that a conviction was secured, that accountability was established, that the legal system responded. Limited in the sense that not every story was told, not every life was represented within the formal proceedings. That duality is part of what makes this case so difficult to process. It resists simple conclusions. It does not allow for a clean ending. Instead, it leaves behind a series of truths. That the evidence was strong enough to convict. That the system, once engaged, functioned as intended. And that the path to that point was marked by delays, by missed opportunities, by a failure to act sooner. As the courtroom emptied, as the formal process came to a close, those truths remained. Not just within the legal record, but within the broader understanding of what had happened. And what it meant. Because justice, while necessary, is only one part of the story. What comes after matters too. And in this case, what comes after would shape not just how the events were remembered, but how similar cases might be approached in the future. How attention is given. How patterns are recognized. How lives are valued. Those questions extend beyond any single verdict. They move into something larger. Something that continues long after the courtroom doors have closed. When the courtroom emptied, the echoes of the trial lingered far beyond the walls of Port Coquitlam. The verdict against Robert Picton carried weight, but it did not erase the years of fear, confusion, and absence that had defined the lives of the victims' families. For them, the aftermath was not a single moment of relief, but a long, uneven process of reckoning with loss, anger, and the awareness of how easily their loved ones had been overlooked. The city, too, had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about neglect, about bias, and about the vulnerabilities of those living on society's margins. The downtown East Side, once seen as a neighborhood to be avoided, became emblematic of systemic failure, a symbol of lives that had been disregarded until it was almost too late. Families struggled to process the dual realities of justice and limitation. On one hand, there was the conviction, a legal acknowledgement of the crimes. On the other, there was the lingering sense of incompleteness. Many of the women whose lives had been claimed by Picton would never have their stories fully told in court. Their names were whispered in reports, acknowledged in evidence, but their lives, full of complexities, dreams, and struggles, had been reduced to statistics for the purposes of a trial. This tension created an enduring pain, a reminder that while legal systems could punish, they could not restore what had been lost. The social response was equally significant. Policymakers, law enforcement, and social advocates were forced to re-examine procedures and attitudes that had contributed to the scale of Picton's crimes. Independent investigation scrutinized past police work, exposing how missed warnings, assumptions about certain communities, and resource limitations allowed the killer to operate undetected for so many years. Reforms began to take shape, missing person reports were treated with greater urgency, interagency communication improved, and outreach to vulnerable populations was strengthened. The city had learned, in the harshest way possible, that indifference could be deadly. Within the justice system, the case became a reference point, not just for its legal outcomes, but for the processes it exposed. Prosecutors and investigators reflected on the decisions that had shaped the trial, weighing the selection of 6 cases against the reality of dozens more. The notion of strategic selection in prosecution was reinforced, showing both its necessity and its limitations. It highlighted the tension between ensuring a conviction and addressing the broader scope of harm. Lawyers studied the case in law schools and training sessions, dissecting its evidentiary challenges, the role of forensic science, and the delicate interplay of witness testimony, DNA evidence, and behavioral profiling. In many ways, the case became as much a study of systems as it was of an individual criminal. On a psychological level, Robert Picton's profile continued to fascinate and disturb those who studied it. Experts described traits of extreme antisocial behavior, a lack of empathy, and escalating violence that manifested in carefully calculated predation. analysts explored how his outwardly mundane existence as a pig farmer had allowed him to operate undetected, how ordinary routines masked extraordinary cruelty, and how his selection of victims reflected societal blind spots. The study of his behavior became a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil can exist within normalcy, and that assumptions about who is safe and who is at risk can be catastrophically misleading. But the most enduring impact was human. Families, advocates, and communities had to navigate grief in ways that no courtroom could fully address. Memorials and vigils were held, names were read aloud, and stories were preserved to honor the lives that had been extinguished. Each remembrance became a statement that these women mattered, that their absence left holes not only in families but in the social fabric, and that society bore a responsibility to recognize and protect its most vulnerable. The narrative shifted gradually from sensationalism toward remembrance, a focus on the human toll rather than the infamy of the perpetrator. Picton's crimes, and the investigation that revealed them, forced a reckoning with morality and societal values. How had a person been allowed to exploit gaps in protection, to prey upon those least likely to be missed? How could systems improve to prevent future tragedies? Communities began to understand the importance of vigilance, of listening to voices often ignored, of acknowledging patterns of harm before they escalated beyond control. The case became a catalyst for conversation, for activism, for change that extended far beyond the initial investigation and trial. In the quieter moments, away from headlines and courtrooms, the lingering questions persisted. Families would continue to navigate memories of their lost loved ones. Survivors, friends, and neighbors would carry scars invisible to those who did not witness the daily struggle in the downtown East Side. The city itself would bear the imprint of a story that could not be forgotten, a narrative of tragedy, horror, and eventual accountability. And through all of it, the stark contrast remained between what was preventable and what was unavoidable, between the moments when society looked away and those when it finally confronted reality. The Picton case remains an enduring symbol, not because of the notoriety of the crimes alone, but because it illuminated the intersections of neglect, vulnerability, and justice. It is a story that teaches, warns, and mourns simultaneously. Justice had been achieved in the sense of conviction, but it was incomplete in the sense of human experience. It left lessons that continue to resonate, that attention matters, that empathy matters, that systems must be vigilant, and that behind every statistic is a life that deserved notice. In the end, the aftermath is not a neat conclusion. It is an ongoing reflection, a dialogue between memory, loss, and society's responsibility, a somber reminder that even as one chapter closes, the echoes of what happened will influence the way communities, institutions, and individuals act for decades to come. Years after the trial, the shadow of Robert Picton's crimes continued to stretch across Canada. The farm in Port Coquitlam was gone, but the echoes of what happened there remained embedded in the collective memory of communities, law enforcement, and policymakers. The story did not end with the courtroom verdict, it spilled outward, forcing society to confront its blind spots, its prejudices, and the vulnerabilities of those it often overlooked. Picton himself became a figure both notorious and studied, a personification of horror that served as a grim reminder of the consequences of neglect. Yet, behind the sensationalism, the real legacy lay in the lives that had been lost, the families left behind, and the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate for over a decade without detection. For the families, the impact was profound and ongoing. The conviction of 6 counts of second-degree murder provided a form of legal recognition, but it could never restore what had been stolen. Birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary milestones continued to be marked by absence and grief. Families found themselves navigating life with a constant reminder of trauma, learning to live with uncertainty about the total number of victims, with some believing the true toll could be closer to 50, or even more. The waiting, the questioning, the replaying of every detail in their minds never fully disappeared. Support networks emerged, organizations dedicated to advocacy for victims of violence formed, and families connected with one another, sharing pain but also creating solidarity. These communities became platforms for raising awareness, demanding justice, and lobbying for systemic change. In Vancouver's downtown East Side, the aftermath reshaped social consciousness. The neighborhood, long stigmatized for poverty, addiction, and marginalization, became a symbol of societal neglect and resilience. Picton's crimes exposed the ways in which vulnerable populations are often ignored, how disappearances can be dismissed or deprioritized, and how systemic failures compound the risks faced by marginalized communities. Social services and outreach programs intensified efforts, focusing on prevention, early intervention, and protection of at-risk individuals. Funding was directed toward mental health services, shelters, and advocacy programs, aiming to rebuild trust between residents and institutions that had previously been perceived as indifferent or ineffective. Law enforcement agencies were also forced to examine themselves in the harshest possible light. The independent review that followed the case revealed failures in early investigations, missed opportunities to connect the disappearances, and a lack of communication across jurisdictions. Policies were updated to ensure missing person reports were treated with urgency, data sharing protocols were strengthened, and officers received training on recognizing patterns that could indicate serial offenses. These reforms, born from tragedy, aimed to prevent the possibility of similar crimes going undetected in the future. Police departments nationwide began using Picton's case as a teaching tool, emphasizing the importance of community engagement, sensitivity to vulnerable populations, and meticulous investigation procedures. Picton's case also had a significant impact on criminology and forensic science. Behavioral analysts studied his methods, his selection of victims, and his use of the farm environment to conceal evidence. His crimes offered insight into escalation patterns, predatory behaviors, and the ways in which outward normalcy can mask extreme pathology. Academic studies examined the intersection of social neglect and criminal opportunity, and the case became a reference point for profiling, training, and research. The combination of forensic breakthroughs, meticulous investigation, and behavioral analysis in this instance has since informed protocols for handling complex serial offenses across Canada and internationally. Media coverage further shaped the public perception of Picton and his crimes. While sensational headlines initially focused on the scale of horror, deeper reporting highlighted societal failings and systemic negligence. Documentaries, true crime books, and investigative journalism pieces began to focus not only on the perpetrator, but also on the victims and the communities affected. This shift helped humanize those who had been silenced or ignored, bringing their stories into the public consciousness and emphasizing the societal responsibility to protect the vulnerable. The coverage also sparked public debate about ethics in reporting, victim advocacy, and the balance between sensationalism and responsible storytelling. Legally, the Picton case set precedents in Canadian criminal justice. The decision to prosecute only 6 of the suspected victims reflected strategic considerations, balancing evidentiary certainty with the need to achieve a conviction. While some viewed this as a limitation, it also highlighted the procedural realities of large-scale serial crime cases. Discussions in legal circles about how to handle mass victim cases, evidence management, and sentencing strategies have been informed by this trial. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys continue to reference it when addressing similar challenges, using the lessons learned to navigate complex legal landscapes. Psychologically and culturally, the case became a lens through which Canadians examined both individual and collective responsibility. It exposed the consequences of indifference, the dangers of societal blind spots, and the human cost of marginalization. Survivors, families, and advocates continually call attention to how prevention, vigilance, and empathy can intersect to save lives. Picton's notoriety, while horrifying, functions as a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil does not exist in isolation and that societal structures can either enable or constrain harm depending on how attentively they operate. The legacy extends even further, influencing public policy and education. Curricula in criminology, social work, and law now integrate discussions of systemic failures alongside psychological profiling. Government inquiries continue to reference the case when evaluating protocols for missing persons and vulnerable populations. Community programs emphasize engagement with those often ignored, teaching early recognition of danger signals, empowering individuals to seek help, and building networks of accountability. The Picton case, in this sense, is no longer just a criminal investigation, it is a catalyst for systemic reflection, preventative strategy, and societal learning. Despite the passage of time, the memory of what occurred at the Port Coquitlam farm endures. The stories of the women, their struggles, and humanity are now central to the narrative, reminding Canadians that the human cost cannot be measured in numbers alone. Every initiative born in response to this tragedy, whether legal reform, social support programs, or forensic advancements, carries within it the weight of those lives and the acknowledgement that society failed them. The Picton case remains a stark illustration of what can occur when vulnerability is overlooked, and it continues to challenge institutions, communities, and individuals to act with awareness, empathy, and vigilance. Ultimately, the 10th chapter of this story is not about the killer, nor is it solely about the victims. It is about a society that was forced to look in the mirror, to confront its failures, and to strive to do better. It is about the long-lasting imprint of horror on collective consciousness and the ways in which lessons can emerge from tragedy. It is about remembrance, reflection, and a commitment to ensuring that those who are most at risk are never again rendered invisible. The legacy of Robert Picton, horrifying as it is, has reshaped Canada's approach to justice, protection, and societal responsibility, leaving a permanent mark that will inform policy, community engagement, and awareness for generations to come. Even years after the conviction, understanding Robert Picton's mind remained an exercise in discomfort and fascination. Experts in criminal psychology scrutinized every aspect of his behavior, searching for patterns, motivations,